Hello fellow deep divers, welcome to another episode. I'm hoping that you've really enjoyed the last 2 weeks. Hopefully last week wasn't too much for you. It kind of got away with me, that one. I did say at the start that there was a lot to go through with these Frightened Rabbit albums, and I wasn't joking. I absolutely did not expect the Midnight Organ Fight to come in at over 100 minutes, but so be it. I'd rather do it that way than miss things out, so that's on me. So this week we're moving on to the next album, obviously. So I'll just make this intro really quick and then we'll get straight into it. Thank you everyone that has supplied anything for these videos. I've had such an overwhelming response from people, especially in the Frightened Rabbit group. There's been so many people that have wanted to get involved in this and have sent me stuff that's appearing throughout this entire series, so if you don't see your stuff where you think it's meant to be, it probably will show up in a later episode. It's just that there's so much, I've just had to pace it out a bit. So yeah, with that, we'll get on to this next one because there's a lot to go through again. Hopefully it won't be quite as long, but I've learned not to trust my instincts with these. Here we go. So when we left Frightened Rabbit at the end of the Midnight Organ Fight, things were looking very, very different for the band. That album had taken what was still a relatively small Scottish indie band and opened them up to a much wider audience. And with that came a huge amount of touring. Now, Frightened Rabbit spent months out on the road, and by the end of 2009 they'd even played in front of around 80,000 people at Edinburgh's Hogmanay celebrations. But eventually the touring had to stop because there was another album to make. And rather than immediately heading into a studio, Scott essentially took himself away from everything. He went to Crail, a small coastal village in Fife, and spent around 7 weeks there writing the songs that would eventually become the Winter of Mixed Drinks. Now, Crail's important because the location didn't simply give Scott somewhere quiet to write. It ended up getting into the DNA of the entire record. Now, Grant later explained that Scott developed this routine where he would go out walking along the beach each day until an idea came into his head. Then he'd turn around, develop that as he walked back home. So Grant specifically said that the location had a huge impact on what Scott was writing. The sea started working its way into the songs along with this recurring idea of testing yourself. And once you know that, suddenly the nautical imagery running through Winter of Mixed Drinks makes perfect sense. Even the artwork itself becomes filled with imagery that feels connected to the sea. And there's a connection here that I hadn't actually considered until I started putting this deep dive together. Because think about the Midnight Organ Fight and where it leaves us with Floating in the Forth. That album finishes with Scott literally placing himself in the water, contemplating whether he's going to disappear beneath it, before ultimately deciding to turn back and live. Now, 2 years later, we begin another album where water becomes one of its central recurring themes. Now, I've not found anything where Scott explicitly says that one was intended as a continuation of the other, so I'm not going to pretend that's what he meant here. But as a thematic connection between the two records, I think it's fascinating, because the Midnight Organ Fight was essentially an album about someone trying to survive the collapse of a relationship. Winter of Mixed Drinks feels much more like an album about asking, right, I survived, what happens next? And Scott himself was in a very different place at this point. The Midnight Organ Fight had been brutally autobiographical. Scott had basically taken the aftermath of a breakup, opened himself up completely, and put all that ugly, embarrassing and incredibly intimate details onto a record. But when it came time to write another one, he didn't particularly want to do that again. In fact, he couldn't really have done it again even if he wanted to, because as Scott rather brilliantly put in an interview at the time, I hadn't had a breakup for a while. He'd actually been relatively content and comfortable, which he joked wasn't particularly helpful when you're trying to write another devastating Frightened Rabbit record. So he deliberately changed his approach, and he described Winter of Mixed Drinks as more of a storytelling record. It was still informed by his own experiences, obviously. Scott never suddenly became completely detached from the songs or anything, but this time he created more distance between Scott Hutchison the person and the character speaking through the lyrics. Now, he described the album as being about escape, possibly even a slight breakdown. and stressed that parts of the story were semi-fictional. And another phrase he used at the time is particularly useful for understanding what we're about to hear. He said the album was about trying to strip yourself to the bone and starting again, because one of the ideas Scott became fascinated with was rejecting the habits and behaviours that you're expected to consider normal, essentially removing the things that have previously defined you and seeing what's left. And before he'd even started properly writing the album, Scott already had one phrase in his head: swim until you can't see land. He described the idea behind that as losing your mind in order to reset your mind and body, washing away what's gone before and beginning again, and he considered that song a good introduction to the themes of the entire record. Now, while Scott was changing as a songwriter, Frightened Rabbit themselves were changing as a band, so by the time we'd reached the Midnight Organ Fight, we'd already seen Scott's original solo project develop into the core trio of Scott, Grant, his brother, and Billy Kennedy. But during the touring that followed that album, Andy Monahan joined the live band, initially helping them reproduce and expand those songs on stage. But by the winter of Mixed Drinks, Andy was no longer simply helping out on tour, he had become a full member, and this would be his first Frightened Rabbit studio album. Now you can hear the growth immediately. This is a considerably more ambitious sounding record than either of the first two albums. There are bigger arrangements, more layers, more instruments, and eventually an expanded cast of additional musicians, bringing things like strings and brass into the Frightened Rabbit sound. And that wasn't accidental either. Scott described Winter of Mixed Drinks at the time as a lot more detailed and complete than the Midnight Organ Fight. In fact, somewhat surprisingly, considering how beloved that album had become, Scott wasn't entirely satisfied with the way the Midnight Organ Fight had been recorded. That album had been captured relatively quickly and had an immediacy and rawness that became a huge part of its appeal. But Scott wanted to go in the opposite direction this time. Winter of Mixed Drinks wasn't intended to sound like a band simply playing together in a room. Individual parts were deliberately recorded separately, layered and constructed into something much more obviously made in the studio, and Scott was quite candid about why. He said, "I didn't make the album I wanted to last time. There were things about the sound of the Midnight Organ Fight that he'd regretted and that he needed to exercise that feeling when they made the next record," which is fascinating with hindsight because Scott's relationship with the Winter of Mixed Drinks would become considerably more complicated over the years. But in 2009 itself, the intention was clear: don't make the Midnight Organ Fight Part 2. Take what Frightened Rabbit had become and push it somewhere else. The band were bigger, the arrangements were bigger, Scott's lyrical perception was changing, and instead of standing in the wreckage of a relationship and documenting every painful detail, he was now standing on a beach in Crail, looking out towards the water and wondering just what might happen if he kept going. And actually there's another connection here that makes this even more interesting. In Floating in the Forth, Scott sings about looking towards the northern side and seeing Fife, even mentioning a boat waiting for him in the port. And where does he eventually retreat to when it's time to write the next Frightened Rabbit album? Crail, on the Fife coast. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that Scott was deliberately foreshadowing the Winter of Mixed Drinks when he wrote Floating in the Forth, but looking back across the two records now, it's a lovely coincidence. And the Midnight Organ Fight ends in the water, looking towards Fife, and the story of the Winter of Mixed Drinks begins with Scott actually going there and walking along that coastline every day, and eventually producing an album absolutely saturated with images of water, swimming, land, and escape. And that's where the Winter of Mixed Drinks really begins. So with those 7 weeks in Crail, giving Scott the foundations of what would become the Winter of Mixed Drinks, the next step was actually turning those ideas into a Frightened Rabbit record. So Scott had already recorded demos while he was staying in Crail, but unlike those very early days where Frightened Rabbit essentially was just Scott, the songs were now being brought into an actual band and developed collectively, and importantly, it was now a bigger band. So Andy Monahan had initially joined during the touring, as I said, but by this point he was a permanent member, contributing additional guitars, keyboards and backing vocals to the record. And I think that's important when you listen to the Winter of Mixed Drinks, because this really is the point where Frightened Rabbit starts sounding like a band capable of making something much larger in scale. They returned to producer Peter Cattis, who'd produced the Midnight Organ Fight, but the approach this time was markedly different. The bulk of the album was recorded at Castle Sound Studios in Pencaitland, Scotland, with additional recording and production taking place at Cattis's Tarkin Studios in Connecticut. But whereas the Midnight Organ Fight had benefited from that sense of immediacy, the band capturing something raw and emotionally exposed, Winter of Mixed Drinks was deliberately constructed, layer by layer, instrument by instrument, and the palette available to them had expanded considerably. Alongside Scott, Grant, Billy and Andy, the album credits include violin and cello with string arrangements, as well as saxophone, trumpet and trombone. I'm not going to sit here and read the entire personnel list because we'll be here till the next album if I do, but I am going to point some of these instruments out as we encounter them, because I think they're really important in showing just how much Frightened Rabbit's arrangements were developing. So compare this to Sing the Greys only 4 years earlier, and the progression is absolutely enormous. And there's another member of the Frightened Rabbit story who appears around this point too. Now, Gordon Skeen, formerly of Make Model, joined Frightened Rabbit as the 5th member at around the announcement of Winter of Mixed Drinks coming out. But there's an important distinction here. Gordon didn't actually play on this album. The record had already been made. Scott even acknowledged that this put Gordon in quite an unusual position. He was joining 4 people who had already gone through the process of creating these songs together, and part of the challenge was going to be developing Gordon's own connection with the material he hadn't helped make. So, the Frightened Rabbit that would go out and tour Winter of Mixed Drinks was already evolving beyond the Frightened Rabbit that had actually recorded it. And then there's the title itself, The Winter of Mixed Drinks. So it comes from a lyric we'll eventually reach in Living in Colour, but Scott's explanation of what it represented gives us another really useful way into the record. So he talked about those periods in life where you become detached from everything, drifting, lost, and essentially stuck in a fallow period. But crucially, Scott said the darkness wasn't really the most important part. It was the moments of joy during the recovery afterwards that actually defined that dark period for him. And I think that's an important distinction between this album and the Midnight Organ Fight. Winter of Mixed Drinks absolutely still contains darkness. You know, this is Frightened Rabbit. Nobody's suddenly skipping through a meadow holding balloons or anything like that. But there's movement here, there's recovery, there's escape, and there's the possibility of coming through something rather than simply documenting how awful it feels while you're trapped inside it. And all that brings us to something I always like spending a bit of time on in these deep dives. The artwork. Because with Frightened Rabbit in particular, I don't think you can really separate the artwork from the records. And Winter of Mixed Drinks might be, for me, probably the best example of that throughout the band's entire career. So Scott is credited with the album's artwork, while the slightly mysterious Layout by DLT credit refers to designer Dave Thomas. And thankfully Dave has actually spoken in considerable detail about how he and Scott worked together during this period. Now, Scott remained the driving creative force behind the imagery. Dave described the Winter of Mixed Drinks artwork as Scott's vision, but by this point their working relationship had become increasingly collaborative. Scott would create illustrations and ideas, while Dave helped develop those elements into a consistent physical package. And I love the way they actually made some of this stuff, because so much of what looks weathered and handmade on Winter of Mixed Drinks really was physically weathered and handmade. They'd use old pieces of paper and found materials. Typography could be created digitally, printed onto rough paper, physically distressed and then photographed. Scott would find objects in Scotland and send them to Dave to incorporate into the artwork. So rather than simply creating something on a computer that looked old and battered, they were actually building these things physically. Now, even the Frightened Rabbit lettering on the front has a story behind it. Dave said that the black area at the bottom of Scott's original cover didn't initially contain the band's name, and Dave suggested that they should put some type there. So Scott sent him the lettering as a pencil drawing, which Dave then filled and coloured to integrate it into the rest of the design. And throughout the artwork, you've got all these recurring Frightened Rabbit symbols and motifs. Most obviously, we've got the double cross again, which obviously first appeared on the Midnight Organ Fight. But by this point, that symbol is becoming a genuine piece of Frightened Rabbit visual language rather than something attached to that one particular release. And we'll see it as we continue through these albums, it doesn't stay the same. It evolves and it gets adapted and reinterpreted alongside the music. And here, with an album absolutely soaked in nautical imagery, there's one little variant that I absolutely love. turn the double cross upside down, and suddenly you've got an anchor. It's such a simple idea, but it's completely in keeping with what Winter of Mixed Drinks is doing everywhere else. So they're taking something recognisably Frightened Rabbit and reshaping it to fit the world of this particular album. And once you start looking through the vinyl packaging and the single artwork, the whole thing just feels connected. The circles, diagrams, crosses, water imagery, distressed paper, handwritten elements, and recurring symbols, they're not just decorations around the songs, they've become part of the identity of the record, which feels particularly appropriate for Frightened Rabbit because we're now 3 albums into their career and they've developed not only a recognisable sound, but an interestingly recognisable visual vocabulary as well. So Scott has gone to the coast looking for a way forward. He came back with songs about escape, recovery, testing your limits, and starting again. The band took these songs and built their most elaborate studio arrangements yet around them. And then Scott and Dave built an entire physical world around that. Which leaves us with one final question before we actually start listening to the album. What actually happened when they released it? Their audience had grown enormously, which meant that for probably the first time in their career, there was now real expectation surrounding a new Frightened Rabbit album. And the first indication of where they were actually heading arrived several months before the album itself came out. On the 16th of November 2009, the band released Swim Until You Can't See Land as the first proper single from the record. And if you're going to introduce an album about escape, reinvention, and pushing yourself beyond the familiar, it's difficult to imagine a more appropriate song to choose. So we'll obviously get much deeper into that when we reach track 2, but Swim immediately demonstrated something important. This still unmistakably sounded like Frightened Rabbit, but everything around Scott's voice suddenly felt bigger. The production was broader, the arrangement was more expansive, and there was a genuine sense that the band was aiming beyond the relatively intimate world of those first 2 records. Then came Nothing Like You in February 2010, another song we'll get to later on Winter of Mixed Drinks, and that finally arrived on the 1st of March. But there was also a divide beginning to appear in what people wanted Frightened Rabbit to be. Some critics absolutely embraced the expansion, because one of the questions hanging over the Winter of Mixed Drinks is whether all that additional production and instrumentation enhances these songs or occasionally gets between us and them. And that's made even more interesting by the fact that Scott himself would eventually have his own reservations about some of the decisions being made here, but I'm deliberately not going into those yet. We'll come back to what Scott thought about Winter of Mixed Drinks with the benefit of hindsight once we've actually listened to the thing ourselves. Before we decide whether Frightened Rabbit lost anything by becoming bigger, more polished and more ambitious, we should probably hear what they actually made, and that brings us to track 1. A song that immediately introduces one of the other major ideas running through the record, because before Scott can swim away from the shore, apparently he's got a few things he needs to get rid of first. And so, the Winter of Mixed Drinks begins with Things, and straight away this feels like exactly the right song to open this. Because after everything we've just talked about, escape, starting again, stripping away the past, that's essentially what Scott spends the next 4.5 minutes doing. Only he starts with the most mundane version of it imaginable, clearing out his stuff. The opening image isn't particularly glamorous. We've got bin bags, damp cardboard boxes, and all these accumulated possessions that are apparently supposed to represent a life. But Scott looks at them and then realises they don't. They're just things. And there's something quite brutal about the way that he describes them. These aren't treasured memories that he's lovingly packing away, they're essentially evidence of a life he doesn't particularly recognise anymore, what he calls pointless artefacts from a mediocre past. And I think the word artefacts is important, because he's almost looking at his own belongings like an archaeologist examining someone else's life. Apparently this person existed, here's the evidence, but none of it actually tells you anything meaningful about who that person was, and that develops into one of the central ideas of Winter of Mixed Drinks. Scott isn't interested in carefully tidying up his past and putting it into labelled boxes, he just wants to get rid of the bastard. The physical possessions become a metaphor for everything else he's carrying around. Old experiences, old versions of himself, old relationships, old expectations, and eventually simply throwing away possessions isn't enough. He starts talking about shedding his clothes, then shedding his flesh, right down to the bone. So we've gone from spring cleaning to complete existential reconstruction remarkably quickly. But that imagery connects beautifully with something Scott said about the album as a whole, that this was about stripping yourself back to the bone and starting again. And Things gives us almost a literal representation of that idea. Remove the possessions, remove the clothes, remove the skin. Find out what's actually underneath, and musically, we're getting a similar sense of transformation, because this doesn't sound like Frightened Rabbit tentatively beginning their difficult third album. It builds. What initially feels relatively restrained gradually becomes this enormous wall of sound. Layers of guitars, distortion and noise accumulating around Scott until the song becomes genuinely huge. Enemy actually singled things out when reviewing Winter of Mixed Drinks, describing its sound as fuzzed up shoegazing, which is a pretty good description of just how far Frightened Rabbit's sonic palette had expanded from Single Graze. And there's a lovely contradiction there. Scott is singing about removing things from his life, while Frightened Rabbit are progressively adding more and more things to the song. The lyrics are stripping everything away, while the arrangement is doing almost exactly the opposite. Whether that's deliberate, I don't know, but I love that tension. And underneath the possessions and the existential decluttering, there's another characteristic Scott Hutchison's subject lurking here: religion, because Scott essentially reduces everything that you've accumulated during your life to something wonderfully bleak. Eventually none of it matters. All you're actually going to need is a coffin and something decent to wear when they put you in it. And then he imagines the reward waiting afterwards: communion followed by eternity surrounded by Christian men. And keep that image of the coffin somewhere in the back of your mind as well, because we've got to encounter a similar image later on in the album. It's another one of those wonderfully Scott moments where something potentially profound about mortality gets undercut by this incredibly dry, slightly antagonistic humour. But then something important changes in the final section, because Scott realises that there's something he doesn't want to discard, or rather someone. After spending the song insisting he doesn't need any of those objects, the final refrain changes the argument. The things don't matter, the past doesn't matter, but human connection does. He describes needing another person's human heat, and that phrase human heat might sound familiar because we've actually already heard Scott use it before. Back on the Midnight Organ Fight in The Twist, he explicitly tells us, "I need human heat." And here we are 2 years and another album later, and even just on the first song, apparently that's the one thing he hasn't managed, or perhaps doesn't want, to leave behind. He can throw away the possessions, reject the past, and strip himself right down to the bone, but that fundamental need for another person is still there. And suddenly this isn't really a song about materialism at all. It's about working out what's actually worth carrying forward when you decide to start again. You can throw away the objects, you can reject the person that you used to be, you can leave your past lying on the floor, but you don't necessarily have to do it alone. And there's actually a really interesting contemporary interpretation of things that connects us directly back to the previous album. So when The Skinny reviewed Winter of Mixed Drinks in February 2010, they described things as essentially a response to the ending of the Midnight Organ Fight. Scott finally followed through on the promise made at the end of Floating in the Fourth to pull himself out of that emotional state. And I think that's a brilliant way of looking at these records together, because we've already talked about that strange geographical connection between Floating in the Fourth, Fife, and Scott eventually going to Crail, but there's an enormous emotional connection as well. And at the end of Floating in the Fourth, Scott decides, not today. And by the beginning of the Winter of Mixed Drinks, he's moved on to, right, what am I actually going to do about it now? And the answer in Things is basically burn the old version, leave it behind, run through the fucking door, which makes the final moments of this song particularly important because there's another subtle change. Earlier he runs through the door, by the end it's we. He's not simply escaping anymore, he's imagining taking somebody with him. And I think that's a surprisingly hopeful place for Frightened Rabbit to begin an album. It's not happy necessarily, we're not going completely insane here, but there's determination in it. Scott isn't sitting amongst the wreckage describing how terrible everything is anymore. He's getting up, he's deciding what matters, he's leaving everything else behind, and he's moving. which makes things almost a mission statement for the winter of mixed drinks. You can't start again until you've prepared to leave something behind, and having emptied the boxes, shed the old skin, and run through the door, there's really only one thing left to do, and that's head for the coast. And having spent things getting rid of everything that we don't need, track 2 takes us exactly where this album was born, to the coast. So Swim Until You Can't See Land is probably the song that most clearly encapsulates what Scott was trying to explore on the winter of mixed drinks. In fact, the title itself existed before much of the album did. We've already talked about Scott going away to Crail, walking along the Fife coastline, and developing this recurring idea of stripping away the things that define you and starting again. Well, Swim takes that idea and turns it into an actual physical act. So Scott arrives at the North Sea and effectively decides, I'm going in. But it's not really a song about swimming, it's about escape and reinvention and deliberately pushing yourself beyond the point where everything familiar remains visible. So Scott describes the North Sea almost as though it's the physical boundary of his own mind. He's been driven there by boredom, frustration, and this overwhelming accumulation of hopes and fears. And I love the images he gives us of himself before he enters the water. He dips his toe in, it's freezing, his body immediately starts going numb. He's a version of man that's built to collapse and crumb, which gives us another little connection to the previous song. Because in Things, Scott was stripping himself back to the bone. Here, the person left underneath apparently isn't particularly sturdy either. But staying where he was seems even more dangerous. And because he tells us that he hasn't come to the coast to disappear, he might have been buried beneath this metaphorical landslide of everything accumulating inside him. And that's why I don't hear the title as a particularly nihilistic instruction. Swim Until You Can't See Land isn't swim until you drown, it's swim until you can't see where you came from. Keep going until the old landmarks disappear, until there's nothing behind you, so telling you who you were supposed to be, and then find out what's left. And that interpretation was already being picked up on when the song first appeared. Pitchfork's contemporary review described the narrator as travelling further and further away from a life that he no longer wants, while the music itself grows around him. And then Scott gives us perhaps the most important image in the entire song. He calls himself a Baptist, and the sea becomes a kind of baptism. Except instead of being cleansed of sin and reborn through religion, Scott describes it as a drowning of the past. And that is basically the winter of mixed drinks in 4 words. He's not drowning himself, he's trying to drown the version of himself that existed before, which again makes this an interesting companion to Floating in the Forth, because water represented something very different there. In Floating, entering the water carried the possibility of ending everything. Here, entering the water represents the possibility of starting everything again. Same basic image, but completely different direction. And then there's someone standing back on the shoreline in this as well. A woman throwing stones at his back as he swims away. Now, we don't necessarily need to identify her as one person. Given Scott's deliberate move towards more fictionalised storytelling on this record, I think that would actually miss part of what he was trying to do. What matters is where she is. She's still on land, she's part of whatever he's leaving behind. And Scott keeps swimming, until eventually even the land itself becomes nothing more than a line in the distance. And then we reach this wonderful image of a body simply drifting amongst water, salt and sky. No possessions, no familiar surroundings, no old identity, just the body. Which is pretty much where Things was trying to get us to in the first place. So these opening 2 tracks really do feel connected. Things removes everything, Swim takes what's left and pushes it out into open water. But then there's that strange question repeated throughout the chorus. Are you a man? Are you a bag of sand? And that isn't just a wonderfully odd Scott Hutchison lyric, because Man, Bag of Sand is waiting for us at track 7. So I'm going to put a large pin in that one for now. And musically though, this is also where the expanded version of Frightened Rabbit becomes really apparent. There's still that recognisable rhythmatic drive underneath everything, but the song doesn't simply race towards a chorus in the way some earlier Frightened Rabbit tracks did. It swells, and one of the reasons for that is the string arrangement by Hauschka. Pitchfork actually singled those strings out when they reviewed the single back in October 2009, describing the arrangement as simultaneously mourning and celebrating Scott's attempts to drown the past. And I think that's exactly what the music achieves. There's melancholy in there because leaving your past behind inevitably, it means losing something. But there's also exhilaration. This isn't someone being dragged out to sea. He swims voluntarily. The further Scott moves from the shore lyrically, the larger the music seems to become around him, and by the time that chorus has been repeated again and again, the song feels enormous. It's exactly the sort of scale Scott was talking about when he described Winter of Mixed Drinks as being more detailed and complete than its predecessor. The Guardian later described the song as uplifting, hearing something almost epiphantic in Scott, becoming that body adrift amongst the waves. And I think that's why this song works so well as one of the defining tracks on the record. There's darkness all over it. Disappearing, drowning, collapse, isolation, but somehow the end result feels hopeful. Scott isn't promising that whatever is waiting beyond the horizon is going to be better. He doesn't even know what's there. The victory is simply having the courage to leave the shore. And there's another bit of history worth mentioning here, because Swim was effectively our first proper glimpse of this new era of Frightened Rabbit. Scott was already performing the then unreleased song acoustically by May 2009, months before Winter was even announced. And it was eventually released as the album's first single on the 16th of November 2009, backed with fun stuff. So, before anybody even knew exactly what the Winter of Mixed Drinks was going to be, Frightened Rabbit chose this as the song to lead us towards it. And knowing everything we now know about the album, I don't think that they could possibly have given us a better one. It gives us the sea, it gives us the escape, the rebirth, the expanded arrangements, the strange man bag of sand phrase that's going to return later, and more importantly, it gives us the central challenge of the entire record. Sometimes starting again isn't just knowing where you're going. Sometimes you've got to get far away enough from where you've been, even if that means swimming until you can't see land. So, after swimming away from everything familiar, you'd perhaps hope Scott might have found some peace out there. Apparently not, because track 3 brings us to the loneliness and the scream. And unusually, for some of the songs we're going to encounter, we actually have Scott explaining pretty explicitly what this one is about. So when the song was released as the final single from Winter of Mixed Drinks in November 2010, he described it as dealing with many of the same things as the album itself. Isolation and the strange behaviour that can start developing when somebody spends too much time alone. Scott said he deliberately kept the imagery fairly sparse because he wanted the listener to fill in the blanks themselves, to enter the song and connect the pieces rather than having every detail explained to them. But he said the basic premise was actually very simple. A person gets a bit lost and cries for help, or perhaps simply cries out because they desperately need somebody to know that they're still there. And that's pretty much exactly where we find him at the beginning. He's somewhere removed from everybody else, asking whether he can still hear the road, footsteps and voices. There's civilization somewhere nearby, he just isn't part of it. And Scott gives us this brilliant variation on the old philosophical question about a tree falling in a forest. He's fallen in the forest. Did anybody hear him? Except this isn't really about whether the fall made a sound. It's about whether somebody can disappear from everyone else's life so completely that eventually they need to do something, anything, simply to prove that they're still there. And that's where the scream comes in. It's not necessarily a scream of pain, it's a scream of existence. So Scott explicitly described that idea in relation to his own life as well, saying that there was something in the song that connected to what he did every day as the singer in a touring band, essentially shouting so that people will listen to him. And I love that interpretation because suddenly the title has two meanings. There's the isolated character screaming because they need somebody to acknowledge their existence, and then there's Scott Hutchison standing on stage every night doing fundamentally the same thing when he's got a microphone and several thousand people screaming back, which becomes particularly important by the time we reach the end of this song. But first, there's that physical imagery again. Scott asks whether anybody can see the blood on his sleeve, and then the scream itself apparently brings the blood rushing back to his face. So we've already had flesh, bones and human heat on the album, now we're getting blood and hearts as well. And I'm not going to start constructing some enormous theory around that just yet, but it's worth noticing because bodily imagery is something Scott continually returns to. And we continue through the next few records. Blood in particular is going to become an image that we encounter again and again. So again, I'm just planting that one there for now because we've got plenty of albums left to get through. But back inside this song, the character has fallen into a ditch, and I think that there's something important about the insistence that he didn't dig it himself. He'd simply been walking for weeks and eventually fell in. There's no grand catastrophic event, no obvious villain, no single moment where everything went wrong. He just wandered until suddenly he realised, oh, I'm stuck. And now he needs somebody else to pull him out, which feels like another development from Things. Because for all the talk on Winter of Mixed Drinks about stripping yourself down, escaping and starting again, Scott keeps acknowledging that complete independence perhaps isn't the answer either. In Things, after throwing everything else away, he still needs another person's human heat. Here, after falling into isolation, he needs another person's hand. And then we reach one of my favourite images in the song, the scream filling 1,000 black balloons with air. It's such a strange, vivid image. All of that isolation and desperation being physically expelled from the body until it becomes something enormous outside of him. And musically, Frightened Rabbit is almost exactly the same thing because the song starts comparatively contained and then it just keeps getting bigger. The drums push everything forward, the guitars open up, the backing voices arrive, and eventually that solitary scream becomes something completely different, a communal one. And that's actually one of the great contradictions at the heart of the loneliness in the scream. It's a song about being completely alone that became one of Frightened Rabbit's great communal live songs. And Stereo Gum later singled it out as one of their finest tracks and specifically described the experience of seeing an entire theatre screaming those wordless vocals back at the band. Contemporary live reviews similarly described audiences continuing those chants even after Frightened Rabbit had left the stage. So the scream that begins as "Does anybody know I'm here?" eventually becomes hundreds of thousands of people answering yes. And then Scott brings the idea of community directly into the lyric itself. There's God again, he finds God and loses it again, which is very Scott Hutchison. But then he talks about trying to glue a community together, falling down and finding love, and finally we arrive at a line that seems to have escaped the song and become part of the language surrounding Frightened Rabbit. The quote, "Our communal heart beats miles from here." And that phrase really did stick after Scott died. Our communal heart became one of those pieces of Frightened Rabbit language that I saw appearing repeatedly within the fan community and through artwork. There's even a Facebook group called Frabbit Mail, which I was part of, where fans would send one another Scott-inspired artwork and birthday cards and Christmas cards and little gifts. I'll save the full story of that for a bit later, but yeah, that term, communal heart, definitely became a bit of a mantra amongst them. But I mention it here just because it's obviously mentioned in the song, and I've personally received multiple pieces of artwork carrying those words. Our communal heart. And there's something rather beautiful about a lyric from a song about profound isolation becoming language people subsequently use to describe belonging to a community. There's even a remarkable example of that happening in December 2018. At a Tiny Changes event in New York, after the performers had finished and even the DJ had stopped, the audience, they apparently didn't leave. They scattered about and began singing the wordless refrain from Loneliness and the Scream. More people joined, arms went around shoulders, and eventually a room full of people were singing the song together, including the line about the communal heart. And I think that tells you something about what happened to this song over time. Scott wrote about somebody who had become so isolated that they needed to scream to simply prove they existed, but Frightened Rabbit turned that scream into something that other people could join, which means the music almost provides the solution to the problem described by the lyric. You start with one voice in the forest asking, "Did you hear me?" and 4 minutes later everybody's answering. And that's also why I think the production works particularly well on this track. We've already talked about how the potential downside of Winter of Mixed Drinks' biggest sound, and we'll come back to it later on as well. But this is exactly the kind of song that benefits from that scale. And All Music picked up on the contradiction too, noting that even when Scott is singing about finding and losing God, there's a warmth to the music that makes him sound liberated rather than isolated. And that's becoming a recurring trick on Winter of Mixed Drinks. The lyrics still contain loneliness, blood, ditches, screams, and existential crises, but It's not pretending loneliness disappears, it's saying that sometimes the first thing that you can do about it is simply make enough noise for somebody else to hear you. And if somebody answers, maybe you're not quite alone as you thought. If somebody asked me to choose one song that contained pretty much everything we've come to associate with Scott Hutchison as a lyricist, I think the Wrestle might be the one that I'd pick. Because somehow in 4 minutes we've got sex, fear, bodies, blood, flesh, bones, violence, vulnerability, death, the sea, strange humour, and some absolutely grotesque imagery. It's almost like somebody took Scott's entire lyrical vocabulary and threw it into a blender. And yet underneath all of that, the basic premise of the Wrestle is actually relatively simple. It appears to be a song about sex. More specifically, that strange combination of desire, fear, and complete vulnerability that comes with becoming physically intimate with somebody. Except Scott, being Scott, he doesn't describe it as two people getting naked together. Obviously not. He turns it into a life or death wrestling match with a terrifying sea creature because apparently that's more straightforward. And importantly, we're still in the water. So things stripped everything away, swim until you can't see land sent us out beyond the shoreline, and now the Wrestle begins with Scott apparently still out there in the dark ocean, except this time something is moving underneath him, and whatever it is, it's taken his clothes. So Scott describes a shape stirring below him, and a pulse travelling through the bloodstream before the first bite begins. What he calls the clothesless wrestle with the clothesless animal. And once you realise what he's actually describing, the metaphor becomes brilliantly ridiculous. Two naked bodies, gripping, biting, pulling, sweating, breathing, fighting for control. Sex has effectively become combat. But beneath the humour, there's something genuinely vulnerable happening. Because Scott isn't presenting himself as some confident sexual conqueror. Quite the opposite, he's terrified. He's exposed, and Scott captures that brilliantly with the idea of being not merely naked, but naked with fear. And that feels like the real centre of the Wrestle to me, because removing your clothes isn't necessarily the frightening part, it's allowing another person close enough that they might actually see you. And that immediately connects the Wrestle to something we've encountered repeatedly in Scott's writing. He desperately wants intimacy, but intimacy absolutely terrifies him. We've already seen that throughout the Midnight Organ fight. Think about the twist, where he craves that human hint, and we've already encountered again on the album on Keep Yourself Warm, where sex is simultaneously something he desperately pursues, and something completely incapable of satisfying the emotional need underneath it. And now on the Wrestle, physical intimacy has become something else entirely, a fight that you're simultaneously trying to win and desperately don't want to end, because there's a particularly revealing contradiction later in the song. Scott calls this other person his enemy, and then immediately asks him to stay close. Scott Hutchison in miniature, really, isn't it? You're terrifying, you're destroying me, please don't leave. And then there's another line that connects the Wrestle beautifully to the wilder winter of Mitch Strugg's narrative. Scott tells us, this is the test I left land for, and suddenly, you're right back inside the journey that we've been following since Swim. Scott didn't leave the shore simply to disappear, he left because he wanted to test himself. Leave safety, leave familiarity, swim beyond sight of land, and eventually you're going to encounter something that frightens you. You don't discover who you are by remaining safely on the beach. And in the Wrestle, that frightening unknown happens to be another naked person. But Scott doesn't merely describe the encounter as rough, he turns the final verse into something approaching a horror film. We've got a burst lung, skin breaking, limbs being torn apart, bone, bristle, spit, even the taste of salt remains in his mouth. Which means we're still simultaneously inhabiting both versions of the metaphor. It's sex, but it's also still this absurd battle happening somewhere in the ocean. So whenever I hear it, I can't help picturing something almost Lovecraftian. Scott swum out into the North Sea, something unspeakable has risen from beneath the surface, and now he's wrestling Cthulhu in the bloody Firth of Forth. God knows what happened during those 7 weeks in fight. Scott doesn't simply tell us what someone's feeling, he seems compelled to make emotion physically happen to the body. Fear isn't abstract, it bites you. Desire grips flesh. Loneliness drains blood from your face. Intimacy tears you limb from limb. And considering Scott's own Live a Long Heart artwork, it's increasingly difficult not to notice how often his visual and lyrical worlds are populated by the same anatomical language. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's some grand Scott Hutchison organ cinematic universe that we're supposed to decode or anything, but it's clearly imagery that he repeatedly found useful, because bodies are messy, relationships are messy, sex is messy, and Scott was very good at refusing to sanitise any of those. Now, musically, the Wrestle is interesting as well, because despite the increasingly violent lyrics, the song itself doesn't sound particularly monstrous. There's actually something strangely beautiful about it. A prominent bass melody runs beneath the arrangement, something contemporary reviews specifically picked out, while the song gradually accumulates guitars, voices, and increasingly unusual textures. Now, AllMusic singled out the choral chanting and backwards samples, describing them as giving the track an almost ethereal quality, and that contrast works wonderfully. The lyric becomes more physical and grotesque, while the music becomes increasingly expansive. And once again, Winter of Mixed Drinks production isn't simply making Frightened Rabbit louder, they're beginning to use the studio itself as part of the arrangement. And there's something else that we can actually show here that I think is particularly special, because for the Wrestle, I've got a reproduction of Scott's original handwritten lyric sheet. Now, I don't want to overanalyse every crossing out or pretend that we can reconstruct exactly what was going through his head from a piece of paper, but I think it's worth seeing because we've spent 4 songs talking about Scott deliberately moving towards a more constructed, less straightforwardly autobiographical form of storytelling. And here we can literally look at one of those songs being constructed on the page. So there's the alterations, the abandoned words, the lines being reshaped, the mess of the writing process, and then compare that with how incredibly controlled the finished metaphor actually is. Because the Wrestle could very easily have become ridiculous. I mean, actually, it is ridiculous, but that's precisely why it works, because Scott takes something completely ordinary, the anxiety and vulnerability of sex, and describes it as though he's fighting for his life against a naked animal somewhere in the North Sea. Somehow, through all the teeth, blood, lungs, muscle, bone, gristle and spit, you understand exactly what he means. And that's Scott Hutchison's writing in a nutshell. It's funny, horrible, tender, physical, embarrassing, frightening, and unmistakably human. And now we reach the biggest song, and I mean that in several different ways. So at 6 minutes and 18 seconds long, Skip the Youth isn't just the longest track on this album, it's actually the longest song that they ever released. Skip the Youth doesn't just have length on its side, the thing is absolutely bloody enormous. The song begins in this strange haze of noise and feedback, slowly gathering pieces around itself. Guitars emerge, keyboards appear, the drums gradually give the whole thing shape, and it just keeps building. And when the Skinny heard the album ahead of release, they immediately picked Skip the Youth out as a standout, and specifically noted the unusually long instrumental build before Scott's vocals finally appear. And when he does finally arrive, he's digging himself a grave. So that's nice. Welcome back, Scott. But I think that opening image tells us almost everything we need to know about the exhaustion at the centre of this song. He's on his knees beneath the moon, digging a hole because apparently all he really wants is somewhere to lie down. And if the only available option happens to be a grave, that'll do. Now, I don't necessarily hear that as Scott literally expressing a desire to die. The overwhelming feeling here is exhaustion. He's tired of the noise, tired of movement, tired of whatever youth is apparently supposed to involve, and he asks for just 2 minutes where he can cover his eyes and shut everything else out. And that feels particularly interesting when we remember the circumstances in which Winter of Mixed Drinks was written. So by Scott's own later account, Frightened Rabbit had just come off an exhausting 2-year touring cycle around the first 2 albums. He said it had broken them down, and after getting home in January 2009, they were told studio time needed to be booked for June, despite the fact that their next record hadn't even been written yet. That left him only a few months to write and demo the album. So when Scott starts Skip the Youth sounding completely knackered, there was probably a degree of truth behind it. And then we get that instruction, move. The voice is telling him to move. And Scott's response is basically, I'd love to, but I'm too tired. And there's a wonderful little contradiction in the next idea. If he can't make himself move, then he can't dance with somebody else. And once again on Winter of Mixed Drinks, another person seems to represent the possibility of being pulled back into life. We had the human heat in Things. We had the hand pulling him from the ditch in The Loneliness and the Scream. And now there's somebody waiting to dance if Scott can actually summon enough energy to stand up. But then we reach the idea that gives the song its title, because Scott acknowledges that physically he isn't old. His body shouldn't be exhausted, he's still supposedly in the prime of his life, except he doesn't feel like it. Youth isn't making him feel young, it's aging him, and I love that inversion. We're constantly told to treasure our youth. These are supposed to be the carefree years. You've got energy, you've got possibility, you've got your entire life ahead of you. And Scott essentially responds, can I skip this bit? There's even something slightly resentful about being told that this is supposedly the best part, because if this is the prime of your life, what the hell is he supposed to be looking forward to? So a contemporary Rolling Stone piece picked up on exactly that contradiction, noting that rather than romanticising youth as the great period of somebody's life, Scott essentially wishes he could bypass the whole bloody thing. And then we get one of those Scott Hutchison lines that could almost function as a mission statement for his entire body of work. If you never feel bleak, life starts to lose its taste. And I absolutely love that, because that's a much more complicated idea than simply saying being miserable is good. Scott seems to be suggesting that darkness provides contrast. If everything is permanently comfortable, perhaps eventually comfort stops meaning anything. You appreciate relief because you've experienced pain. You recognise happiness because you know what its absence feels like. And the idea feels particularly appropriate on Winter of Mixed Drinks because this entire record has been playing with exactly that contrast. The lyrics repeatedly give us isolation, drowning, blood, braves and exhaustion, while the music frequently sounds absolutely euphoric. Now, the AV Club actually picked that line out of its contemporary review and described it as a succinct Frightened Rabbit statement of purpose. And I think they're right. You could almost put that sentence across the entire Frightened Rabbit catalogue. Not life is bleak, but the bleakness is part of what gives everything else its flavour. Which brings us back to the body again, because Scott describes hearing the drums as the worn-out beat of a tired heart. There's the heart imagery again. We've only just had the communal heart in the previous song, and here the heart has become percussion. And musically, Grant's drums really are central to this thing. They provide the pulse underneath all of those enormous layers surrounding Scott. So the lyric almost acknowledges the arrangement that's carrying it, except that tired heart is being told you're young, and Scott just isn't buying it. If this is you, skip it. And then Frightened Rabbit essentially spend the remainder of the song hammering that idea into the ground. Skip the youth again and again and again, until the phrase stops sounding like a clever lyric and becomes almost mantric. And this is where we need to talk about the production, because if you want one song that demonstrates both what Scott was trying to achieve with the Winter of Mixed Drinks and what he eventually thought he'd got wrong with it, it's Skip the Youth. When the album was released, its sheer scale was frequently treated as a strength. Like The Guardian, for example, they described Skip the Youth as enormous, while praising Winter of Mixed Drinks as the sound of Frightened Rabbit up in their game. Another contemporary review called the track the centrepiece of the record, highlighting the slow build into a wall of guitars and laid vocals. And I completely understand why. When the thing reaches full force, it's fucking huge. But Scott's own opinion became considerably less charitable with time, and in 2018, when he was asked to rank the 5 Frightened Rabbit albums, he placed Winter of Mixed Drinks near the bottom and explained exactly what he thought had happened. After the relative success of the Midnight Organ Fight, he said they were essentially let loose in a nice studio, and Scott's instinct was, if you want this record to sound bigger, add more stuff, and add some more, and perhaps another guitar, and another guitar, and actually, apparently so many guitars that they ran out of recording tracks. And Skip the Youth was the example Scott specifically chose. The album wasn't mixed where they'd recorded it, so eventually the session files were taken to Peter Cattis in Connecticut, and Scott remembered Cattis opening them and basically wondering, what the hell have you lot been doing? And Scott's conclusion almost 8 years later was fascinating. He'd realised that making music sound grand isn't about the number of layers, it's about choosing the right things. And because he didn't yet know how to achieve the scale he wanted, his solution on Winter of Mixed Drinks had simply been to keep piling more and more into and onto the songs. So he described Skip the Youth specifically as overburdened by layers of sound. And this is where I find myself slightly disagreeing with Scott, because I can completely understand what he's saying. You know, there is an absurd amount happening here. It's dense, it's cluttered, it's arguably excessive, but I think that's part of why it works. I think this particular song, because it's about exhaustion and being overwhelmed and unable to move, the noise and scrape of life is wearing him down, and he wants to cover his eyes and disappear somewhere quiet. And meanwhile, the actual recording is gradually burying him beneath sound. So whether it was deliberate or simply the accidental result of Scott getting carried away in the studio, there's something wonderfully appropriate about hearing this exhausted voice struggling through an arrangement that's becoming increasingly enormous around him. He wants everything to stop, while the band keeps adding more and more and more, until eventually the song itself feels almost too heavy to carry. And for me, that absolutely suits it. And there's another interesting wrinkle here. When Frightened Rabbit took Winter of Mixed Drinks on tour in 2010, Skip the Youth was regularly being used as the opening song. Contemporary reports from Washington, Chicago and San Diego all document them beginning shows with it, which is a pretty bold way to start a gig. No quick crowd pleaser, no immediate modern leper. Instead, here's a 6-minute song with nearly 2 minutes of build-up, and apparently it worked. Those live accounts describe the song building at this kind of huge emotional release Frightened Rabbit were becoming increasingly good at producing on stage. And perhaps that's another reason Scott eventually preferred those songs live. In the same 2018 interview, he said friends had told him that they enjoyed hearing Winter of Mixed Drinks material on stage because the band had effectively reduced the songs to their necessary parts. 5 people could create something enormous without needing the ridiculous number of layers Scott had accumulated in the studio. And that's actually quite an important lesson in the Frightened Rabbit story, because Winter of Mixed Drinks isn't simply the album where they discovered how to sound bigger, it's also the album where they discovered that they didn't want to sound bigger. Scott would carry that lesson forward. He'd eventually realised that scale didn't necessarily come from another overdub. Sometimes it came from performance, space, dynamics, the right instrument arriving at the right moment, and occasionally not adding another fucking guitar. But I don't want Scott's later dissatisfaction to overshadow what Skip the Youth achieves, because underneath all those layers, it's one of the clearest expressions on Winter of Mixed Drinks of the strange limbo Scott was writing about. He's young but he feels old, he's alive but digging somewhere to lie down, he wants to move but can't summon the energy, and he wants darkness because without it the light apparently loses its meaning. He wants connection, but first he has to shake himself back into motion. And that's what makes the title so clever. Usually we fear getting older. Scott fears what being young is doing to him. Youth isn't something disappearing too quickly, it's something he desperately wants to get through. And perhaps that's why the enormous repetition at the end works. It starts as an observation, then a complaint, then an instruction, then almost a plea. Skip it. Get me beyond this bit, take me somewhere else, because if this is supposed to be the prime of my life, I'm absolutely fucking exhausted. And after 6 minutes and 18 seconds, still the longest Frightened Rabbit song we've ever had, Scott finally gets his wish. We skip ahead, and suddenly, after arguably the biggest and most overloaded recording Frightened Rabbit have ever made, track 6 arrives and gets straight to the bloody point. So, after 6 minutes and 18 seconds of Skip the Youth slowly building itself into an enormous wall of guitars, noise and general exhaustion, I think Nothing Like You arrives at exactly the right moment, because this is probably one of the most straightforward songs on the Winter of Mixed Drinks. And I don't mean that as a criticism, quite the opposite. It's 3 minutes long, it's fast, it's catchy, It's got a much more conventional verse-chorus structure, and dare I say it, it's actually quite poppy. And after the sheer weight of Skip the Youth, I think the album needs it. We've just spent more than 6 minutes watching Scott dig himself a grave because he's too exhausted to deal with being young, and now suddenly, off we go. But naturally, because this is Scott Hutchison, underneath that bright, energetic music, we're immediately back to tumours, operations, and bodily malfunction. Because lyrically, Nothing Like You seems to be about moving beyond one relationship by discovering somebody completely different. There's a past person and there's a new person. And the important thing about the new one is contained right there in the title. She's nothing like you. This isn't Scott finding a replacement version of somebody he's lost. The difference itself is the attraction, and that makes this quite an interesting song to encounter after the midnight organ fight. That entire album was dominated by somebody Scott couldn't seem to remove from himself. And even when the relationship was over, emotionally he was still completely entangled in it. Here, there's almost a sense of, actually, perhaps something completely different would be quite nice. And one contemporary review rather wonderfully reduced the entire premise to essentially, fuck you, look how awesome this new girl is. Which is considerably less academic than anything I was going to say, but also not entirely inaccurate. Except Scott can't simply say I've met somebody new and she's really different. Obviously we've got to go to the hospital first. So he describes this previous relationship through the language of illness and treatment. And the new woman isn't presented as some miraculous solution either. She's not the cure for cancer. There's actually one of the lyrics that Fat Cat themselves singled out when promoting the single. And I think there's something interesting in that, because Scott isn't really saying that this new person has fixed me. Quite the opposite. She's explicitly not a cure. She's simply something different. And that feels slightly more mature than the romantic idea that another human being can arrive and magically repair everything that's wrong with you. Although Scott being Scott, he expresses that maturity by comparing the situation to oncology. Baby steps. And this is where another thread in his writing is beginning to become noticeable. We've spent half the album talking about the body, and now something else is starting to creep in alongside that anatomy. Clinical language. We've got cancer, tumours, operations. The body isn't merely something Scott uses to describe emotion anymore. He's beginning to talk about emotional problems almost as though they're things that could be diagnosed and examined or medically treated. Now, I'm not going to make some enormous theory out of that just yet, but remember it, because as we continue through the catalogue, the slightly clinical vocabulary is going to return, and again, and again. So, another one to put a pin in. It's another one of those little pieces of Scott's lyrical language that we're beginning to recognise, and there's a particularly horrible little physical imagery involving the old relationship being something that has effectively become attached to the body. Something unwanted, something that needs to be cut out. And again, Scott turns emotional separation into physical surgery. You don't simply get over somebody, you remove them. And that's quite a development from the midnight organ fight, where separation seems virtually impossible. There, Scott repeatedly behaves as though losing another person meant losing part of himself. Here, the answer is considerably more decisive. Fine, cut the bastard out. And despite all that medical imagery, the song itself refuses to become miserable. That's probably what makes Nothing Like You such an effective midpoint for the album. The music is doing something completely different from the words. It's brisk, it's immediate, and there's a driving guitar riff underneath it. Fat Cat described the song at the time as a fast-paced but musically rich, specifically presenting the cheer and celebration of those Winter of Mixed Drink songs as something of a subconscious response to the angst of the midnight organ fight. And that feels right, because Winter of Mixed Drinks hasn't suddenly stopped containing dark imagery, but the relationship Scott has with darkness feels different. There's forward movement. The old relationship is something to be removed rather than endlessly excavated. There's somebody new, there's excitement, and the music sounds like it's already halfway out the door when Scott's still explaining what happened. Even some of the contemporary critics who weren't entirely convinced by the song recognised just how deliberately accessible it was. The Skinny, for example, actually considered Nothing Like You the weakest track on Winter of Mixed Drinks, criticising it as overly radio-friendly and particularly jarring immediately after the ambition to skip the youth. And that's interesting, because I almost think that's precisely why it works the way it does. If Winter of Mixed Drinks followed Skip the Youth with another 6 minutes slow burning epic, the middle of the record become incredibly exhausting. Instead, Nothing Like You acts almost like opening a window. 3 minutes, big hook, traditional structure, done, and then straight onto the second half. It's Frightened Rabbit demonstrating that they're becoming more ambitious, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every song has to be more ambitious. Sometimes you just need a bloody good pop song. And the band clearly recognised its accessibility, because Nothing Like You became the second single from the Winter of Mixed Drinks, released on 22nd of February 2010, exactly 1 week before the UK album release. It was backed by Scott's solo BBC session recording of Learned Your Name, while the digital release also contains an alternative version of Nothing Like You. And there was actually 2 videos for it as well. Alongside the more conventional promotional video, the band made their own DIY version, featuring Frightened Rabbit performing what Pitchfork described as a kind of homemade musical in their underwear. Because apparently after 3 albums, somebody finally realised the problem with Frightened Rabbit's marketing was simply too many trousers. And there's one final bit of chart history that's quite interesting. On its original 2010 release, Nothing Like You reached number 74 on the UK physical singles chart, but in May 2018, it unexpectedly returned to the physical and vinyl charts, reaching number 19 on the physical singles chart and number 16 on the vinyl singles chart. Obviously, the circumstances surrounding that resurgence are something we'll deal with properly much later in the series, rather than dragging them backwards into our interpretation of a 2010 song. But it's worth recording as part of the single's history now. For now though, Nothing Like You does exactly what I think Winter of Mixed Drinks needs to do. It's immediate, it's melodic, it's almost jaunty, and it's probably one of the closest things on the album to a straightforward pop song. And somehow Scott still manages to fill the whole thing with cancer, tumours and surgical procedures, which is perhaps the most Frightened Rabbit definition of brightening things up a bit. And actually, this reminds me of the way I Feel Better follows The Modern Leper on the Midnight Organ Fight. It's much earlier on that record, but I think it's performing exactly the same job. After something that carries that much weight, you need a track that immediately changes the temperature, and Nothing Like You does exactly the same here. But more importantly, after Skip the Youth spent 6 minutes buried under its own enormous production, Nothing Like You proves Frightened Rabbit can still get in, make the point, and get out again. And apparently that means that we're now exactly halfway through the Winter of Mixed Drinks. So naturally it's time for a 2.5 minute existential identity crisis involving a bag of sand. So, after the shortest, sharpest and probably poppiest song on the Winter of Mixed Drinks, we reach something altogether much stranger. Man, Bag of Sand. Although if you've been following these deep dives from the beginning, you might already be thinking, hang on, haven't we done this before? And yes we have. Because Man, Bag of Sand is essentially this album's answer to Extra Super Very. Back on the Midnight Organ Fight, the twist introduced us to the phrase Extra Super Very, before that idea reappeared later as its own short transitional piece. And the Winter of Mixed Drinks pulls almost exactly the same trick. So Swim Until You Can't See Land introduces us to that wonderfully strange question, are you a man, are you a bag of sand? Then 5 tracks later, this little piece of the song returns as Man, Bag of Sand. So this isn't us simply noticing a coincidence retrospectively, because Scott actually talked about why these little pieces existed. And when the AV Club asked him in 2010 why every Frightened Rabbit album seemed to contain an instrumental or interlude somewhere around the middle, Scott described them as something of a selfish indulgence on his part. But Man, Bag of Sand was particularly important to him, because unlike the enormous studio production surrounding much of Winter of Mixed Drink, this was actually recorded in Crail, the place where the album began. And I think that makes its position here considerably more meaningful, because we've spent the entire first half of the deep dive talking about Scott escaping to the Five Coast, walking beside the sea, developing the themes that would eventually become Winter of Mixed Drinks, and recording demos while he was there. Then the songs went away, the band got hold of them, the arrangements became larger, more instruments arrived, more guitars arrived, and then some more guitars arrived, and eventually Peter Cattis opened Skip the Youth and presumably wondered whether somebody had accidentally sent them the entire contents of a recording studio. And then sitting right there in the middle of it all, this little fragment of where the record actually came from. And Scott said that having that original recording on the finished album created a connection between the conception of these songs and what they eventually became. So suddenly, Man Bag of Sand makes much more sense. It's not really supposed to compete with the other songs, it's an artifact. It's a little surviving piece of the album's birthplace, and Scott acknowledged that some listeners probably regarded it as an automatic skip, but his response was wonderfully straightforward. For me, it makes the record, and I think knowing where it came from makes me appreciate it considerably more, because musically it really is a world away from something like Skip the Youth. It's sparse, lo-fi, strange, almost ghostly, and underneath it are these chopped up fragments of spoken dialogue. Pitchfork specifically highlighted those spoken samples when discussing how Winter of Mixed Drinks had moved beyond Frightened Rabbit's previous simpler arrangements into more experimental territory. But over everything else we have that familiar refrain from Swim Until You Can't See Land. And Scott gave another interview in 2010 where he explained exactly why he brought it back. He said he wanted the listener, as they moved into the second half of the album, to be reminded of where they started. So he was interested in taking pieces of songs and reusing them elsewhere because it helped tie the album together, repeating themes but presenting them slightly differently each time. And that's really important because it tells us that some of the connections we've been identifying across Winter of Mixed Drinks aren't simply us desperately standing in front of a corkboard connecting pieces of string. Scott was consciously building connections into the record. Ideas return, images return, lyrics return, but they don't necessarily return in exactly the same form. And I think that's something that we're going to want to remember as we continue through the Frightened Rabbit catalogue, because without giving away something that we're not supposed to reach until the next album, Scott clearly doesn't lose his interest in making different parts of a record speak to one another. He just finds different ways of doing it. But there's another reason I think Man Bag of Sand is important, where it sits. So look at what the album has done. Skip the Youth, 6 minutes 18, the longest song that they've ever put on an album. Absolutely smothered in layers of production. Then Nothing Like You arrives at a compact 3 minutes. Poppy, straight in, straight out. And now Man Bag of Sand strips everything back even further at under 2.5 minutes. So across these 3 tracks we've gone from maximum to compact to minimal. And whether that particular sequence was consciously designed that way or not, it works beautifully as pacing, because Man Bag of Sand becomes almost a little intermission. The first half of Winter is over. We're briefly transported back to Crail, we're reminded of Swim, we're reminded of the question at the centre of that song, and then we're sent onwards into side 2. Now, in fact, Scott explicitly described the purpose of the reprise as reminding everybody of their starting point before moving towards the second half, which makes its placement as track 7 feel very deliberate indeed, and interestingly, not everybody liked it. Several contemporary reviews considered Man Bag of Sand one of the album's weaker moments. Sputnik Music called it a largely unnecessary acoustic reworking of Swim, while Tiny Mixtapes similarly felt the reprise added very little. And ordinarily, I might understand that criticism. If you listen to Winter of Mixed Drinks as simply a collection of 11 individual songs, then yes, why do I need to hear part of Swim Until You Can't See Land again? But Scott clearly wasn't thinking about it that way. He was thinking about the album as an album, and that's a distinction that matters. Man Bag of Sand doesn't necessarily need to justify itself as a standalone Frightened Rabbit song. Its job is structural. It connects the 2 halves of the record, and it brings Crail physically back into the album. It recalls one of the central lyrical ideas, and it gives us a brief moment of space before the second half begins, which is exactly what Extra Super Very did on the Midnight Organ Fight. Different song, different sound, different purpose within the album's particular story, but the same underlying instinct. Take something we've heard before and make us hear it differently. And there's another interesting layer to the phrase itself. When Scott discussed Winter of Mixed Drinks with the AV Club, he described the album as being less concerned with the songs about girls that dominated the Midnight Organ Fight, and more concerned with the self, discovering what you're actually made of. And the example Scott himself gave, that question from Swim, are you a man, are you a bag of sand? So perhaps that bizarre little phrase is more important to Winter of Mixed Drinks than it initially appears. Strip everything away as Scott does in Things, leave the shore, remove the familiar landmarks, push yourself into unfamiliar situations, and eventually you're left confronting a pretty fundamental question. What actually are you? Something solid with identity and agency? A man? or something shapeless that simply takes whatever form its surroundings force upon it, a bag of sand. And I really like the idea of something coming back in different forms here, because within the musical world of the album, Man Bag of Sand almost sounds like something that's been washed out to sea and eventually returned to the shore. There's even something about its stripped back sound that makes me imagine Scott sitting around a fire on the beach after dark, singing this strange little remnant of the song back to himself as it's washed back up towards him. So, cards on the table before we start. Foot Shooter is probably my least favourite song on the Winter of Mixed Drinks. Now, before somebody shoots me, I know this one is held pretty highly amongst fans, and I certainly don't dislike it. There's genuinely nothing on this album that I dislike, but if you force me to rank the 11 tracks, this would probably be sitting at number 11. And actually that's one of the reasons I've been interested to pull this one apart properly, because sometimes doing these deep dives confirms exactly why I love a song, and sometimes I discover that there's considerably more happening inside than I'd previously given it credit for. Because the basic premise is wonderfully simple. Scott gets drunk, Scott opens his mouth, Scott says things he shouldn't, Scott wakes up sober, Scott thinks, oh for fuck's sake Scott, again, hence Foot Shooter. The title obviously comes from the expression shooting yourself in the foot, doing something that ultimately causes damage to yourself, and Scott spends this entire song describing that process in almost military terms, except the weapon isn't a gun, it's his mouth. And right from the beginning, alcohol is moving through his bloodstream, while his brain is effectively shouting instructions down towards his mouth, and his mouth apparently responds, fire at will, which immediately gives us one of those lyrical echoes that we've been collecting across these records. Scott begins with booze in his blood, running fast. And having spent the last documentary with the midnight organ fight, it's difficult not to hear a little echo of fast blood. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that Scott deliberately sat down and thought, I'll reference that song here, but it's another example of particular combinations of words and images recurring naturally through his writing, and blood is rapidly becoming one of the big ones. But apparently blood wasn't quite enough for Foot Shooter, because Scott then decides to work his way around practically every remaining part of the human body. We've got the brain, mouth, thumbs, eyelids, ears, neck, skin, toes, eyes, and face. So at this point I'm starting to wonder not whether Scott's got an anatomy textbook that he's ticking things off as he goes through. And that continues this increasingly obvious pattern across Winter of Mixed Drinks. Scott doesn't merely describe emotions psychologically, he makes them physical. The consequences of what he's saying aren't floating around somewhere abstractly, they're travelling from brain to mouth, they're breaking toes, they're changing the colour of his face, they're something another person physically needs to protect their ears, neck and skin against. The argument becomes an attack on the body, and that explains the chorus. Scott tells the person on the receiving end to protect themselves, cover up, thicken your skin, brace for impact, because once he's loaded, he's verbal, and there's a wonderfully concise description of the problem. He's not claiming alcohol transforms him into somebody completely different, it removes the barrier between thinking something and saying it, and once that dam bursts, everything comes out, which gives us another important piece of Winter of Mixed Drinks imagery, because Scott describes that verbal outpouring as a dam bursting. The other person is drowned out, they need to get into a boat, and eventually they'll simply be washed away. So here we are at track 8, and we're still in the water. The ocean has changed function again though, because in Swim Until You Can't See Land, water was cleansing. It represented escape and rebirth. In the Wrestle, it became the setting for intimacy, fear, and whatever Lovecraftian sexual nightmare Scott apparently encountered off the coast of Fife again. And now water has become language itself. His words arrive in such quantity that they overwhelm somebody. You can drown in them, which becomes extremely important later. But first, morning arrives, and this is where I think Foot Shooter becomes much more interesting than simply Scott gets drunk and says stupid shit. Because alcohol wears off, his mouth goes numb, he limps away from the damage, and then comes what Scott describes as the stark and sobering dry sunlight. And I love the use of dry there. We've just had the dam burst, drowning, boats being washed away, then sobriety arrives, and suddenly everything is dry. It's almost as though Scott is using the water imagery to represent the intoxicated state itself. and when he's drunk, everything floods out uncontrollably. Morning comes, and the flood has receded. Unfortunately, all the damage is still lying around, and now Scott has to look at it, and he desperately wishes that he could simply blink and erase everything that he said and did, which is probably one of the most universally relatable hangover thoughts Scott ever wrote. Not, God, my head hurts, but please tell me I didn't actually say that. And this is where Footshooter differs slightly from some of Scott's earlier relationship writing, because he's not presenting himself as the wounded party, he's not blaming the other person, he's not even particularly interested in explaining why he behaved that way. He knows exactly who caused the problem, he did. And then we reach what I think is the most fascinating image of the entire song, because Scott tells us the other person that if he shoots at them, they should shoot back. Fair enough, mutually assured verbal destruction, but then he imagines both of them drowning in pools of the thick dark words they threw. And remember that image. I'm not going to explain why yet, but we're going to have to travel quite a bit further through the Frightened Rabbit catalogue before we get to it. But another one to stick a pin in. Because once again, Scott isn't treating language as something abstract. Words have matter. They occupy space. They can stain things, and apparently if you produce enough of them, you can drown in them. But after all the damage, all the booze, and all those dark words, Scott does something remarkably simple. He apologises. And there's no clever metaphor, no anatomical horror, no boat, no drowning, no self-deprecating punchline. He essentially admits this isn't your fault, it's mine, and I think that simplicity is important. For all of Scott's extraordinary talent for finding elaborate metaphors for emotional situations, sometimes the most meaningful thing you can say is the most straightforward one. I did this, I'm sorry. And suddenly I understand much more clearly why Enemy characterised Footshooter as one of Winter of Mixed Drinks' songs of redemption. Because redemption here doesn't mean Scott has fixed the behaviour. The chorus immediately tells us he's going to shoot himself in the foot again. He's still flawed, he's still repeating the cycle, but he's aware of it. And perhaps that's the first necessary step towards changing it. And musically, I think that's where the song's reputation becomes easier for me to understand as well. Because Footshooter doesn't sound anywhere near as miserable as its subject matter suggests. There's a strangely uplifting quality to it. Like, those backing vocals open everything up, and the chorus becomes much larger than the comparatively restrained verses. One contemporary review actually considered it as the strongest melodic song on the entire record. And Stereogum later praised the arrangement precisely because it avoids some of Winter of Mixed Drinks' excesses. They described it as one of the album's more restrained productions, particularly highlighting the unusual persistence of the drum pattern and Scott's chorus melody. And coming immediately after our discussion of Skip the Youth, that's interesting because here's Frightened Rabbit achieving something big without simply throwing everything at it. The chorus still feels enormous, but there's space around it. Now the individual parts get room to work, which is essentially the lesson Scott later said Winter of Mixed Drinks taught him. Maybe Footshooter understood it before he did. And I think I've probably discovered something myself by digging into this one. Is it suddenly my favourite song on the album? No. Let's not get carried away. If I'm ranking Winter of Mixed Drinks tomorrow, then Footshooter is probably still somewhere near the bottom, but lyrically, there's much more going on here than I previously appreciated. It's another piece of the nautical imagery. It's practically an inventory of Scott's obsession with the human body. It gives us that little echo to vast blood. It contains an image involving dark liquid words that we're going to encounter in a dramatically expanded form much later on. And more importantly, it shows something that perhaps separates Winter of Mixed Drinks from the relationship writing of Midnight Organ Fight. Scott isn't merely examining what other people have done to him anymore. He's examining what he does to other people and admitting the responsibility for it, which feels like another small but significant part of the process that this entire album's been describing. Strip everything away, work out what's underneath, and then if you don't particularly like everything you've found, at least have the decency to admit that some of it is yours, even if you're probably going to shoot yourself in the foot again. So I'm going to start this one with a little confession that may annoy a few people again. Because after admitting that Footshooter is probably my least favourite song on the album, Not Miserable would probably be sitting immediately above it at number 10. Now, I realise I'm probably digging myself an increasingly large hole here because Not Miserable is actually held in pretty high regard. Pitchfork singled it out as one of the best songs on the album, while another contemporary review went even further and called it the defining moment on the record. So clearly I'm wrong, but it's my deep dive, so I don't care. And actually, the title itself pretty accurately describes how I feel about the song. Do I dislike Not Miserable? No. Am I particularly excited when it comes on? Also, no. I'm just not miserable, which is perhaps the most appropriate review I could possibly give it. But lyrically, there is a lot more going on here, because Not Miserable might be the clearest expression yet of something we've been watching develop throughout the entire album. Scott Hutchison is getting better. Not good, let's not get carried away, just better. And I think those distinctions matter enormously. In fact, we've actually got a way of making Scott's emotional improvement quantifiable. And to do that, we need to go right back to the beginning. The first song on the first Frightened Rabbit album, The Greys, Everything is Grey. 2 years later on the Midnight Organ Fight, I Feel Better. Okay, progress. Then another 2 years pass, and we arrive at Not Miserable. Ladies and gentlemen, measurable improvement. And honestly, as a British person, I completely understand this level of optimism. Ask someone over here how they're doing, and we're very unlikely to respond. It's life is wonderful, I'm fantastic, I've never been happier. We'll say, yeah, not bad. And somehow everybody understands that as a glowing 5-star review of life. But underneath the joke, there's actually something very Scott about all three of those titles, because none of them really describes happiness. I Feel Better is entirely relative. Better than what? Yesterday? Last year? The emotional carnage of the Midnight Organ Fight. Basically, I feel better than that. Great. It doesn't tell us though, and it merely establishes that whatever the previous condition was, this is an improvement. And Not Miserable is even more carefully qualified. Scott isn't saying I'm happy, he's simply established that his current emotional state is no longer meeting the required threshold for misery. And I'm going to call this Scott Hutchison's quantifiable optimism, because that's about as positive as we're apparently allowed to get. But that cautious optimism is really important. This album hasn't been about Scott suddenly becoming a completely different person. He hasn't swum away from the coast of Fife, emerged from the North Sea and announced, everything's fixed. It's been about movement, trying something different, throwing things away, leaving familiar places behind, testing himself, recognising some of his own disruptive behaviour and gradually moving away from where he was before. So perhaps Not Miserable is actually a much more honest destination than Happy would ever have been. And Scott immediately takes us back to one of the album's most persistent images, water. The song begins after the flood. Scott is picking through the aftermath and discovering the pieces he thought he'd lost. Except when he gathers everything together, there really wasn't that much there, and I love that image because it fits beautifully within where Winter of Mixed Drinks began. Remember things? Scott started the record stripping away possessions, clothes, flesh, and all the other things he'd accumulated around himself. Now we've had a flood, everything has been washed away, and once the water recedes, he discovers there wasn't actually very much worth recovering. It's another kind of cleansing. Except Scott remembers a particular night when he almost drowned while completely alone inside a house. And that's a really striking inversion of the water imagery that we've had so far, because previously drowning has generally required Scott to go towards the water. He deliberately swims away from land. He encounters something beneath the sea in the Wrestle. Footshooter bursts the dam and floods somebody with words, but here the water has apparently come to him. He's drowning indoors. There's no ocean required anymore. He's looking backwards, not returning to the misery, but acknowledging that it happened. And that distinction is important. Remembering something isn't the same as still living inside it. Which brings us back to the relationship that dominated the Midnight Organ Fight. Scott talks about the love he lost and everything else that came out in the wash. There's the water again. Except after all the emotional devastation, what's left? Essentially, pocket fluff. That's brilliant. We've just spent an entire album previously watching this relationship become the centre of Scott's universe. It consumed everything: sex, identity, home, self-worth, his sense of the future. Then enough time passes, everything goes through the wash, and what seemed monumental eventually becomes this tiny collection of debris you pull out of your pocket. That's one of the biggest differences between the two albums. The past hasn't disappeared, it's just become smaller. And then Scott gives us perhaps the clearest status report on his emotional recovery anywhere on the album. He's no longer burdened, he's free of disease, there are no greys, there are no liver spots, and most of the misery has gone. Hang on, no greys, there we go. We've finally beaten track 1 of album 1. It only took 4 years. So Scott started the entire Frightened Rabbit album story with the greys. Now, no greys. Quantifiable optimism confirmed. But there's another funny contradiction in this verse. Scott also celebrates having no liver spots. So aging is apparently bad, which is interesting because 4 songs ago he wanted to skip the youth. Make your bloody mind up, Scott. Youth is aging him too much. Actual aging is also unacceptable. So we've successfully eliminated young Scott and old Scott. Apparently there's a very specific acceptable age somewhere in the middle, and unfortunately he hasn't told us what it is. But beneath that joke, I think the contradiction actually that fits Winter of Mixed Drinks, because wanting to escape where you currently are doesn't necessarily mean you know where you want to end up. That's been the entire album. Move, swim, leave, strip things away, change, but the destination has remained surprisingly vague. And here's the physical ageing imagery, giving us another example of something we've been tracking throughout the album. The body, bones, disease, liver spots, cancer. But notice the clinical vocabulary again too. Disease. We've only just had cancer, tumours and operations in Nothing Like You. Now emotional well-being is once again being described partly through the language of health and illness. Scott doesn't really feel better, he's free from disease. And that's something that we're going to keep watching as the discography continues. But then, Scott slightly undermines his own optimism because he doesn't say all the misery's gone, only most of it. And what's left has apparently gone right down to the bone. And that's such a Scott Hutchison qualification. For one brief second, everything's fine. Then, well, apart from the misery embedded in my fucking skeleton, and this is why I don't think Not Miserable is really a happy song. It's a song about resilience. Scott isn't pretending the darkness has disappeared. In fact, the final verse explicitly acknowledges that it hasn't. And this is where the religious language returns. Scott looks back at the hymns he used to sing and the prayers that came from his bitter tongue. They're history now, not erased, history. And I think that's a really important choice of word. Once again, the past still exists. It just doesn't have to be the present. We've encountered religious imagery repeatedly in Scott's writing by this point, despite his own complicated relationship with belief, God, prayer, hymns, religious ritual. It's another vocabulary he seems instinctively drawn towards when he's trying to give emotional experiences a sense of scale. But here, even those old prayers belong to another period of his life. There's something he can look back at. And then comes the qualification that stops his entire song becoming some simplistic recovery anthem. The room might currently be illuminated, but Scott knows exactly where the light switch is. The darkness can return instantly, that's crucial. He's not claiming I'm cured, he's saying it hasn't come back yet. And suddenly the title, Not Miserable, makes perfect sense. He can't promise happiness, he can't even promise that the misery is permanently gone. He knows perfectly well that the darkness remains possible. But right now, the lights are still on, and I think that's actually considerably more powerful than simply writing, I'm happy now. Because recovery from heartbreak, grief, depression, whatever form of darkness somebody has experienced, doesn't necessarily arrive at some enormous cinematic moment where the clouds part and everything becomes wonderful. Sometimes the achievement is simply noticing today isn't as bad as yesterday. Then another day passes and another, until eventually you realise that you're no longer where you started. That's quantifiable optimism again, and musically, Frightened Rabbit make that gradual transformation happen around Scott. The song begins relatively restrained, with piano and atmospheric noise creating this slightly uncertain space around him. A contemporary review specifically noted the slow opening and background fuzz before the arrangement begins filling itself out. Then the thing grows, backing vocals arrive, the arrangements expand, and eventually that repeated declaration of being not miserable becomes something much larger and more communal, which creates another one of those wonderful Frightened Rabbit contrasts. Scott's language remains cautious. The music absolutely isn't. The lyrics say, "Things are somewhat better." The band responds, "Fucking celebrate!" And contemporary critics really responded to that. Pitchfork considered it one of Winter of Mixed Drinks' strongest tracks, and saw the title itself as a clue to the record's changed emotional outlook. Scott doesn't necessarily sound happy throughout the album, but he clearly sounds less heartbroken and more optimistic than before. And even though this is personally sitting at number 10 in my ranking, I completely understand that interpretation, because perhaps Not Miserable is one of the most important songs on the album without necessarily being one of my favourites. It gives us a progress report, and if we can compare it to where Scott began, the progress is actually pretty substantial. The Greys, I Feel Better, Not Miserable. No miraculous transformation, no declaration that everything is wonderful, just incremental improvement. And perhaps that's ultimately what the Winter of Mixed Drinks is about. Not becoming somebody completely new, not forgetting everything that's happened, not reaching some permanent state of happiness, just moving far enough away from the person that you were that you can finally turn around, look back, and recognise the distance that you've travelled. The flood happened, he remembers nearly drowning. The lost relationship still exists in his history. Some of the misery apparently made its way all the way down to his bones. And he knows that darkness could return with the flick of a switch, but it hasn't, not yet. So when Scott says he's not miserable, for once I think we should probably let him have it, even if the song itself is only number 10 on my list. And after spending 9 tracks stripping away the past, swimming through floods, wrestling sea monsters, shooting ourselves in the foot, and finally achieving the dizzy emotional heights of being not miserable, something rather important happens next. Because Scott doesn't merely tell us his escapes to the Greys. For the first time, he's living in colour. And now we reach my favourite song on the Winter of Mixed Drinks. And after everything we've just discussed in Not Miserable, I don't think this song could possibly arrive at a better moment. Because apparently, we've finally made it. If you've been following these deep dives from the beginning, we've now managed to create what I'm calling the Scott Hutchison Quantifiable Optimism Scale. We started literally on the first song of the first album of the Greys. 2 years later, I Feel Better. Another 2 years later, Not Miserable. And now only one song later, Living in Colour. Bloody hell. What's really interesting is that this isn't merely a connection that we've invented by spending far too long staring at Frightened Rabbit lyrics, because when Fat Cat released Living in Colour as a single, they made essentially the same connection themselves. Their original description presented the song as the sound of a less frightened rabbit emerging from darkness into light, and they specifically suggested that its optimism could be understood as a response to the midnight organ fight, and more literally, sing the Greys. Yes! Quantifiable optimism, confirmed. And suddenly, I think these last 2 tracks work even better together. Not Miserable was Scott cautiously acknowledging that things weren't as terrible as they used to be. That's still defined by a negative. He's not miserable. Here, we finally get a positive statement. He's not merely escaped the Greys, he's living in colour. And musically, Frightened Rabbit sound like they're celebrating it. This thing absolutely bursts into life. There's a propulsive quality to the drums, the guitars are huge, the backing vocals keep pushing everything upwards, and the whole arrangement has this wonderful sense of forward momentum. Enemy specifically singled out the song's anthemic chorus when reviewing the album, describing it as part of what felt like an exciting new dawn for the band. And I completely understand that, because this is probably one of the most straightforwardly euphoric things Frightened Rabbit has recorded up to this point. But this is Scott Hutchison, so obviously he's still talking about sickness, drowning, bones, and being put in a coffin. And immediately we're back in one of the central worlds of this album, water, which I think demonstrates just how deeply the nautical theme Scott developed while writing in Creole became embedded in the language of Winter of Mixed Drinks. It isn't simply swim until you can't see land plus some nice boats on the artwork. Water is everywhere, and here Scott imagines himself effectively needing to be rescued again. Except there's an interesting difference from earlier in the record. At the beginning, Scott seemed determined to do everything himself. He was stripping away his possessions, leaving familiar places, swimming until he couldn't see land, testing himself. Now, there's an acknowledgement that sometimes you need somebody else in the boat. And that brings us back to another theme we've been quietly tracking throughout the album: human connection. That might sound like a tiny detail, but on an album built around movement, I think it matters. Back in Skip the Youth, Scott essentially couldn't move, and he wanted to dance, but he was too exhausted. 5 tracks later on Living in Colour, he's practically incapable of standing still. And that's one of the reasons I love this song so much. It doesn't merely tell us Scott is moving forward, it sounds like movement. The entire thing feels like it's running towards something. And even when Scott's lyrics wander back towards illness and mortality, the music refuses to collapse underneath them. Which brings us to another recurring piece of vocabulary: sickness. We've really started noticing this during the second half of Winter of Mixed Drinks. We've had cancer, tumours, operations and disease, and now sickness returns again. Scott increasingly seems interested in describing emotional states through clinical or medical language, and alongside that comes the body again, because apparently there are still several pieces of human anatomy Scott hasn't successfully squeezed into the album. But one particular image connects directly back to something we noticed right at the beginning. Scott imagines himself being pale like the wood of a box containing bones. And remember what we said all the way back in Things? The song begins the album with Scott effectively stripping himself down until we're almost left with nothing but the person underneath. Now, near the end of the record, we're back at the bones. Once again, Scott reduces the human body to its fundamental structure, except this time there's a coffin around it. Because apparently, Living in Colour was becoming dangerously cheerful, and somebody needed to correct the situation. And then there's another connection to the previous album that I really like, because Scott refers to being porked. And after spending an entire documentary with the Midnight Organ Fight, it's impossible for me not to hear pork. Again, I wouldn't claim Scott deliberately sat down and inserted a reference to this earlier song, unless he ever said so, but this is exactly what we're discovering by moving chronologically through his writing. Certain words, certain physical images, certain ways of describing intimacy keep resurfacing. They become part of Scott's lyrical vocabulary, and pork is particularly interesting, because that song represented one of the most exposed moments on the Midnight Organ Fight. Almost nothing between Scott and the listener, whereas Living in Colour is practically the opposite. It's huge, it's bright, it's communal, it's bursting outwards. So even if that little verbal echo is completely incidental, the contrast between the two songs tells us something about just how far the sound of Frightened Rabbit has travelled in 2 years. And then, finally, we get the words we've been waiting for since the introduction: the Winter of Mixed Drinks. The album title actually appears inside Living in Colour, and suddenly the phrase feels less like an abstract title and more like something Scott has actually lived through. A winter, a period of isolation, drinking, confusion, transition. The aftermath of one relationship, the beginning of something else, and now he's looking back at that period from somewhere slightly different. And that's important because the Winter of Mixed Drinks isn't called the summer of perfect mental health. We're still dealing in Scott Hutchison's carefully regulated levels of optimism here. But winter itself is temporary. That's built into the word. A winter is something you pass through. And if you read the album's journey that way, then Living in Colour begins to feel almost like the arrival of spring. The record started with Scott throwing away his old life, Then he went into the water, lost sight of land, experienced isolation, wrestled with himself, became exhausted, recognised his own destructive behaviour, and eventually he reached not miserable, and now the colour comes back. And that's why I think the title drop works so beautifully here. The winter of mixed drinks is something Scott can now refer to, something with a shape, something that happened, something he survived. And there's another connection here that takes us right back to the midnight organ fight, because Scott refers to putting his heart somewhere safe, and there's something about that which reminds me of Poker Game. That constant negotiation between intimacy and self-protection. The midnight organ fight repeatedly showed Scott wanting another person, while simultaneously recognising how dangerous that dependency had become. Winter of Mixed Drinks hasn't eliminated that contradiction, but the relationship Scott has with it seems different. There's more momentum, more awareness, more willingness to move, and crucially, more colour. And Frightened Rabbit clearly recognised the song's ability to explode in a live setting. It regularly appeared very late in the sets in subsequent years, frequently as part of the encore, where its enormous release could help drive the show towards the loneliness and the scream. Documented between 2012 and 2013, shows repeatedly placed those songs together near the end. And I can completely understand why, because Living in Colour feels designed for a room or arena full of people. Those backing vocals, that chorus, the momentum, it's another example of something Winter of Mixed Drinks does extremely well when the production works: scale. And unlike Skip the Youth, where Scott later felt they'd achieved scale by simply piling too many things onto the recording, Living in Colour feels much more focused to me. It's enormous, but it moves. Nothing seems to be holding it down, which is appropriate for a song whose entire emotional purpose seems to be escaping exactly that. And then there's the single itself. Living in Colour became the album's third single, released through Fat Cat on the 24th of May, 2010. Living in Colour is comfortably my favourite song on this album, partly because it's just a brilliant song, and also because I think it represents the album's journey better than almost anything else here. We started in grey, stripped everything away, went into the water, lost sight of land, drowned, resurfaced, discovered we weren't miserable anymore, and now colour. Not perfection, not permanent happiness, not some miraculous cure. Scott still has sickness, bones, coffins, water and fear, and all the usual Frightened Rabbit furniture is still scattered around the place, but something fundamental has changed. He's moving, he's dancing, he's connecting, he's looking back at the winter rather than remaining trapped inside it. And for the first time in the entire three-album journey, Scott doesn't merely sound better, he sounds alive, which would be an absolutely beautiful place to end the Winter of Mixed Drinks. Unfortunately, there's still one song left. And so we reach the final song on the Winter of Mixed Drinks. And after Living in Colour, Frightened Rabbit could have made this very easy for themselves. We've spent almost the entire album watching Scott attempt to move forward. We've stripped away the past, swum away from land, screamed for connection, established Scott Hutchison's quantifiable optimism scale. Perfect, everybody's happy, Scott's dancing, we've survived the winter, roll credits. Except Frightened Rabbit apparently looked at that perfectly satisfying happy ending and said, nah, you're not getting away that easily. Because Yes I Would immediately drags us back towards some of the darkest imagery on the entire record. And in what I'm reasonably confident is one of the most unusual words ever placed prominently inside an indie rock chorus, haemophiliac. Who even attempts to put that in a song? What's fascinating about Yes I Would is that while the lyrics take us somewhere considerably darker, the music ultimately does almost the exact opposite, and I think that's the key to understanding why this is the song that they chose to end the album with. Because right from the beginning, we're returning to somewhere familiar. Scott begins by crying out for sand, and we've heard that before, and then comes the phrase that makes the connection impossible to miss. He can't see land. We've come all the way back to swim until you can't see land, except there's a crucial difference. Back on track 2, losing sight of land was the objective. Scott deliberately wanted to swim far enough away from everything familiar that the shore disappeared. That was the challenge, the liberation, the whole bloody point. Now, he can't see land, and he wants somebody to hold him. There's a very different emotional state there. Earlier, I need to get away from the shore. Now, where the fuck has the shore gone? And I think that's an important qualification to everything that the album has been saying about escape. Because leaving your old life behind sounds wonderfully liberating until you realise that you've also removed all the familiar landmarks. You can get deliberately lost, but eventually you're still lost. And Scott even acknowledges that directly. He's been told to get lost in order to find himself, except apparently that didn't bloody work either. And that's where I think Yes I Would starts challenging the apparent resolution of Living in Colour. The album spent 10 songs moving forwards, but movement doesn't guarantee arrival. Scott has changed. That doesn't necessarily mean he's discovered who he's changed into. And then we reach the extraordinary chorus. The wound bleeds, then it scabs, and Scott says he feels like a haemophiliac. There's that clinical language again we've spent the second half of the album noticing. Emotional damage isn't merely emotional in Scott's writing. Once again, it's physical pathology. Something happens inside the body, something breaks, something bleeds, something attempts to heal. And that's why I really like the sequence, bleeding to scabbing, because a scab means healing has already started. The wound hasn't disappeared, but the body is repairing itself. And that feels like Winter of Mixed Drinks in miniature. Scott isn't healed, he's healing. Those are very different things. And then comes the question, if somebody carried him back, would he change? And Scott's answer gives us the title, Yes I Would. That's important because despite everything we've heard, despite getting lost, despite being unable to see land, and despite the bleeding, Scott still believes change is possible. Or at least he's willing to say that it is, and then he insists that he can't sink now, which is another fascinating reversal, because the entire album has been obsessed with water. Water has represented liberation, danger, intoxication, isolation, sexuality, language, practically everything except somewhere you'd sensibly go for an ice paddle. And now at the very end, I can't sink now. Not after everything it took to get here, but then Scott immediately introduces doubt. What happens if nobody throws him the rope? And that's a crucial question because Winter of Mixed Drinks has repeatedly contrasted self-reliance with human connection. Scott began things by stripping everything away. He swam away from land himself, but throughout the record, other people kept appearing. Scott can swim, but eventually he might still need somebody else to help him out of the water. And then comes one of the bleakest images on the album. There's a tear in his side, and it pours and pours and pours. And I love the construction of that line because Scott could simply tell us the wound is bleeding heavily. Instead, the repetition makes us experience the excess. It pours and pours and pours. The language itself refuses to stop bleeding. And considering how obsessed Winter of Mixed Drinks has been with bodies, Scott couldn't really have found a more appropriate final track. Blood, wounds, scabs, his side tore open. Then we reach the line that for me takes Yes I Would somewhere considerably darker. Scott wonders whether anybody would even notice if he wasn't around, and that gives us that devastating image of the loss of a lonely man barely making a sound. And there's something almost philosophical about that idea. It immediately makes me think of the old question that I mentioned earlier. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? If somebody surrounded by people disappears, their absence creates noise. People ask questions, people search, something has changed. But what about somebody who already feels completely isolated? What sound does their absence make? And that's an incredibly bleak thought to place on the final song of an album that we've just spent describing as getting more and more optimistic. But importantly, and this is something that I established right back at the beginning of the Sing the Graves deep dive, I'm not going to drag hindsight into this and reinterpret every mention of drowning, disappearance or death through what happened years later. This is a song written in 2009 and that's the context in which I'm treating it, because within the Winter of Mixed Drinks itself, that lyric already has plenty of meaning. The entire album has repeatedly asked what happens when somebody removes themselves from the world that they knew. Scott deliberately wanted isolation. He went to Crail, he stripped things away, he swam away from land. But Yes I Would asks the uncomfortable question sitting on the other side of that fantasy. What if you isolate yourself so successfully that nobody notices you're gone? And suddenly the scream, and the loneliness in the scream, makes even more sense. Perhaps connection isn't merely desirable, it's proof that you're there. Somebody hears you, somebody answers, somebody throws the rope, and then something extraordinary happens. Because if you simply read the lyrics to Yes I Would on paper, you would probably imagine a completely different piece of music. This thing is dark as hell. Getting lost, sinking, bleeding, scabbing, haemophilia, a wound that won't stop pouring, the possibility of nobody noticing your disappearance. It's not exactly walking on sunshine, and yet listen to what Frightened Rabbit do with it. The song keeps growing. Scott starts pushing his voice higher and higher until he's singing in such a voice that we don't normally hear from him. And underneath him, the music starts to soar, not just optimistically, but by the time that final chorus reaches its peak, this thing sounds genuinely euphoric. It's full of joyful heart, which makes absolutely no bloody sense when you look at the lyric sheet. And that's precisely why I think it's such an amazing piece of songwriting, because making sad lyrics sound sad isn't particularly difficult. Slow everything down, strip the arrangement back, put everything in a mournful key. Let the music tell the listener, this is the sad bit. But taking lyrics this bleak and somehow making the person listening to them still feel lifted, that's considerably harder, and Frightened Rabbit pull it off spectacularly. AllMusic described Yes I Would as a sweetly direct closer, while the Skinny called it an understated send-off that might initially pass you by but rewards repeated listening. And I think the latter description is particularly accurate, because it doesn't announce itself as this enormous finale, it becomes one, which is very different from how Frightened Rabbit have ended either of their previous albums. Sing the Greys ended with Snake, quiet, small, unassuming, almost creeping away without making a fuss, and with a little bit of humour to it. And then the Midnight Organ Fight did something completely different with Floating in the Fourth, where it felt like the enormous emotional climax of the album, and it could easily have ended there, but then Who'd You Kill Now wanders in afterwards like a little post-credits scene, and after everything Scott has put us through, gives us one final wry smile on the way out. But Winter of Mixed Drinks does something that they haven't done before, because Living in Colour feels like it could have been the ending, and in fact if this were a simpler record it probably would have been. Scott escaped the Greys and he's now living in colour, everything's wonderful, good night everybody, but Yes I Would says no, we're not letting you get away completely happy. The darkness is still here, the wounds haven't disappeared, the blood hasn't disappeared, loneliness hasn't disappeared, the possibility of sinking hasn't disappeared, and Scott still can't see land, but the colour hasn't disappeared either. And I think that's the crucial point. Yes I Would doesn't undo Living in Colour, it proves it. Because Scott can bring all of these darker images back, and they don't sound grey anymore. The lyrics remain wounded, the music has become capable of something else. And maybe that's the real triumph of the Winter of Mixed Drinks. Scott hasn't stopped writing about darkness. Frightened Rabbit have simply discovered that they don't always have to make that darkness sound dark, which is a pretty enormous development from the band we met on Sing the Greys. The emotional complexity hasn't disappeared. If anything, it's increased. But their musical vocabulary has become large enough to contain two opposing emotions at the same time: pain and joy, isolation and community, sinking and soaring, grey and colour, and that makes the ending of Yes I Would feel almost like the album's final argument. Scott's lyrics say, I'm still struggling. The band responds, listen to what we can do with that struggle now, and everything lifts. Which is why, despite containing some of the bleakest lyrics on the entire album, The Winter of Mixed Drinks somehow doesn't leave me feeling bleak. It doesn't end quietly like Sing the Greys, and it doesn't devastate me and then give me a little grin like The Midnight Organ Fight does. Instead, it refuses to give me a completely happy ending, but then sends me home on a high anyway. And I think that takes an enormous amount of power from a songwriter, because by the time Scott reaches that final chorus, I'm not thinking about haemophilia. not thinking about blood and wounds and sinking. I'm listening to Scott Hutchison pushing his voice towards the ceiling while Frightened Rabbits surge upwards underneath him, and somehow I feel fucking great. That's an extraordinary trick, and perhaps it's the perfect ending for an album that began with Scott trying to work out what remained when everything familiar had been stripped away. 11 songs later, he still doesn't have all the answers, he still can't see land, and he still needs somebody to throw in a rope. But he knows one thing: if somebody carried him back, would he change? Yes, he would. And with that, the winter of mixed drinks is over. Having spent considerably longer pulling this album apart than I ever expected to when I started, I think there's one word that sums the whole thing up better than anything else: evolution. Because the winter of mixed drinks feels like the point where Frightened Rabbit stop merely developing the sound and start actively testing what else Frightened Rabbit could be. And that's happening everywhere. The band has expanded, the arrangements have expanded, the instrumentation has expanded, Scott's lyrical vocabulary has expanded, and the artwork has evolved. Even the little double cross logo, that's expanded as well and evolved and become an anchor, for God's sake. And importantly, not every part of that evolution necessarily worked perfectly, but that's evolution. You try something, you discover what works, and you discover what doesn't. And whatever you learn becomes part of what you do next. Coming out of the Midnight Organ fight, Frightened Rabbit were in a completely different position from the band that had entered it. That album had dramatically increased their profile. They'd toured heavily, the live band had grown, Andy Monaghan was now properly embedded within Frightened Rabbit, and by the time Winter of Mixed Drinks arrived, Gordon Skeen had also joined, turning them into the five-piece contemporary reviewers we're now describing. The palette available to Frightened Rabbit is considerably broader than it had been 2 years earlier, but Scott also approached the writing differently, and after all that touring he removed himself from everything and spent those weeks alone in Crail, walking around the Fife coastline and developing these songs. And as Grant later acknowledged, that location had an enormous influence on what emerged. The sea became part of the record, not simply as scenery, but as a means of testing yourself and pushing yourself towards limits. And bloody hell, we've certainly seen that. Because I knew Winter of Mixed Drinks had a nautical theme before doing this deep dive, but I don't think I appreciated just how thoroughly that theme was soaked into the entire record. Scott swims, he drowns, he sinks, he loses sight of land, dams burst, floods arrive, people need boats, things are washed away, sand disappears and returns, words themselves become something you can practically drown in, and finally, after deliberately swimming until he can't see land near the beginning of the album, he reaches the final song, can't see land, and suddenly seems considerably less certain that this was such a brilliant idea. But the really clever part is that water doesn't have one fixed meaning. Sometimes it's cleansing, sometimes it's freedom, isolation, danger, language, intoxication. Sometimes Scott actively enters it and sometimes it comes flooding towards him. And that's far more interesting than simply saying, it's the nautical album. The imagery involves within the album itself, and even Man Bag of Sand seems to embody that idea. Something returning in a different form, stripped down and weathered, almost as though it's been washed back onto shore. Which brings us back to something Scott was already writing about before Winter of Mixed Drinks even existed. Floating in the Forth, on the northern side, and that tantalising little reference to Fife and a boat in the port. Do I think Scott deliberately foreshadowed the next album? No. But knowing that he would subsequently go to Fife, walk that coastline, and develop a record overflowing with nautical imagery, it's one hell of a coincidence. But the water was only half of what surprised me, because doing these albums chronologically has allowed us to see something I don't think we'd notice nearly as clearly if we were simply reviewing this album by itself. Scott is developing his own lyrical vocabulary. Blood, bones, skin, hearts, bodies, disease, wounds, God, prayer, sex, water, and increasingly on this album, clinical language, cancer, tumours, operations, disease, haemophilia. Apparently, Scott Hutchison discovered a medical dictionary somewhere between albums 2 and 3 and thought, aye, I'll have some of that. But these aren't simply words being repeated, The ideas surrounding them are evolving. Something appears on one record, Scott returns to it later in another form, and sometimes its meaning changes, and sometimes it expands, sometimes it combines with something else, and occasionally we encounter something on Winter of Mixed Drinks that we're going to hear again several years from now in a much more developed form. That's why I'm trying to be careful with words like foreshadowing, because Scott wasn't necessarily deliberately planning clues for albums he hadn't written yet. They're early echoes, I'd say, and ideas that he was clearly interested in and naturally returned to. And because we're doing the entire catalogue chronologically, we get to watch these ideas evolve. And that's becoming one of my favourite things about doing the Frightened Rabbit deep dives. We're not simply examining what Scott Hutchison wrote, we're watching him become the songwriter that he eventually became. That evolution isn't confined to the music, because Scott wasn't simply responsible for the lyrics and songwriting, he created the artwork too. And once again, that little Frightened Rabbit double cross continues changing alongside the records. Here, beautifully, it becomes incorporated into the nautical identity of Winter of Mixed Drinks, including that brilliant transformation into something resembling an anchor. It's such a small detail, but it demonstrates how carefully Scott thought about these releases as complete pieces of work. Music, lyrics, artwork, typography, recurring symbols. The album wasn't simply 11 audio files and a picture slapped on the front. The visual identity belonged to the same world as the songs, and we know Scott himself was aware of that continuing evolution of that symbol, because years later he'd actually joke on stage about how increasingly elaborate it had become. But for now, I love the fact that the logo itself seems to be doing exactly what the band is doing, changing without becoming unrecognisable. And that brings me to something important, because evolution doesn't automatically mean improvement. One of the great ironies of Winter of Mixed Drinks is that Frightened Rabbit suddenly had far more freedom to make a larger record, and in hindsight, Scott wasn't entirely convinced they'd always used that freedom wisely. That's something we've heard particularly clearly on Skip the Youth. The temptation was, we've got more available to us, so let's use more. More instrumentation, more layers, more production, more sound. And eventually Scott came to realise that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is less, which is an incredibly important lesson for any creative person. Sometimes less is more. Anyway, moving swiftly on. But seriously, I think Scott's retrospective reservations about Winter of Mixed Drinks are important, because they make the album more interesting, not less. This is a band testing its limits. You don't discover where those limits are without occasionally going beyond them. And perhaps Frightened Rabbit needed to make an album this big before they could work out precisely which part of being big actually suited them. Now, despite Scott's later reservations, critics in 2010 largely thought Frightened Rabbit had succeeded. On Metacritic, the Winter of Mixed Drinks currently sits at 78 out of 100, based on 28 critics' reviews, 22 of which were positive, 6 were mixed, and none were negative. That's a very strong reception. Enemy gave it 4 stars, calling it a stunning return and recognising the shift away from the band's earlier alt-folk sound towards something larger, while also identifying something we've spent this entire deep dive discussing: optimism. The Guardian also gave it 4 stars and described the band effectively upping its game, highlighting the enormous choruses and themes of escape, freedom and reinvention. Pitchfork were noticeably more reserved, with 6.6 out of 10, feeling that some of the raw emotional immediacy of the Midnight Organ fight had been lost, despite recognising the larger and more sophisticated sound. And I think that difference in opinion is interesting, because it's essentially the argument surrounding the album in miniature. Is this Frightened Rabbit becoming bigger and better, or did something bigger remove some of what made them special? And my answer is a bit of both, which is probably why this album is such an important part of the revolution. Commercially, Winter of Mixed Drinks reached number 61 on the UK album chart, which is another sign of the band's growing audience, and even though 61 isn't a particularly high placing, keep in mind that the Midnight Organ Fight didn't even chart. They weren't this little cult Scottish band anymore. I cannot finish this without returning to this little discovery that somehow became one of my favourite things about this entire deep dive: Scott Hutchison's quantifiable optimism scale. Because right at the beginning of Frightened Rabbit, The Greys. 2 years later, I Feel Better. 2 years after that, Not Miserable. And finally, Living in Colour. Ladies and gentlemen, progress. And remarkably, even Fat Cat's contemporary description of Living in Colour explicitly connects its optimism back to Sing the Greys. So our ridiculous theory actually has some basis in how the music was being presented at the time. But underneath the joke is something I think genuinely matters. Winter of Mixed Drinks doesn't tell us Scott is suddenly happy, it tells us he's moving. So where does the Winter of Mixed Drinks sit for me? It's an album I think I've actually come to appreciate more by doing this deep dive. There are individual songs that I don't love quite as much as others. I've already admitted that. Foot Shooter would probably sit at the bottom of my personal ranking with Not Miserable just above it, but that's relative. They're not songs that I dislike, they're simply the songs that I reach for least on an album where the standard is remarkably high, to be honest. At the other end, we've got Living in Colour, which remains my favourite, and pulling it apart has probably made me love it even more, because now that I can see it where it is in the bigger journey of things as well, from grey to better to Not Miserable to Colour. But that's more of an individual thing. The Winter of Mixed Drinks now feels important to me because of what it represents in the Frightened Rabbit story. So Sing the Greys introduced us to them. Midnight Organ Fight established what Scott could do as a songwriter and gave the band the breakthrough that changed everything. Winter of Mixed Drinks asks, okay, what else can we do? And the answer isn't always perfect. Sometimes they go too far. Sometimes there's too much happening. Sometimes Scott's instinct that bigger automatically meant better would eventually come back to bother him. But they had to try, because without experimentation there's no evolution. And by the end of Winter of Mixed Drinks, Frightened Rabbit are unquestionably a different band from the one that we met 4 years earlier. Bigger, more confident, more ambitious, more sophisticated, occasionally more excessive, but still unmistakably Frightened Rabbit. And perhaps the best symbol for that is still Scott's little double cross. It's changed, it's been manipulated, it's become part of an anchor. Eventually it will change again, but however much Scott alters it, you can still recognise it for what it started as. And I think that's exactly the same thing that is happening in the band. So that's the Winter of Mixed Drinks. It's an album about escape, reinvention, isolation, connection, and ultimately evolution. And if this record represents the band discovering just how far they could expand their sound, the next stage of the story asks a rather different question. What happens when everything they've learned across these first 3 albums starts coming together? Because next time we arrive at Pedestrian Verse, and something tells me that we're going to have a lot to talk about. So, thank you once again for coming along and watching this week's deep dive. This was a lot longer than I expected it to be. I genuinely didn't think this would be anywhere near as long as the Midnight Organ Fight. I was obviously proved wrong. Very sorry for that. So obviously next week we will be moving on to Pedestrian Verse, which has a little bit of a different arc to it than the last 3 albums I've had for me. But I'll explain all that then, because this has been long enough anyway. So just a quick wrap up, just to say thank you very much for watching. Usual spiel how I appreciate you all and love you all. Thank you very much for watching, liking. Please subscribe, please tell your friends, please get the word spread about these, because I'm loving doing them so much. And until next week, I hope you all have a fantastic week, and I'll see you all then.